No, I expected this to be a bit controversial, but I think is the increasing perception or the increasing awareness in Africa that somehow the engagement with the new partners, particularly China, because China is the largest new, emerging power in Africa, it's quite mutually beneficial to Africa than what has been the case with traditional development partners. For some of the reasons being quite obvious that 50 years of development partnership with the West is what we have in Africa. I'm not attributing Africa's conditions to that, but we haven't seen much change. And in fact, this frustration is shared by people in the West as well. The citizens of the West are also questioning, after billions of years poured into Africa, why haven't we seen much change? And that's a very legitimate concern on the part of donors, citizens. But Africans are even more acutely aware of that and are beginning to question, are there alternatives to traditional donor partnerships? And at the level of attitude, China sees its interest or its development as directly linked with Africa's development, or at least with Africa. One could, well, for the benefit of the doubt, and say, well, is Chinese interest really about Africa's development? But the point is, concretely, empirically, on the ground, China's engagement in Africa has always resulted in some productive asset or some productive sector being left, whether it's in the form of infrastructure or whatever. I'm quite disagreeable by the fact that, by the comment that Chinese give donations and gain access to African oil. I don't think most of the agreements, the partnerships with African countries have been in the form of either barter trade or some kind of concrete exchange in the form of investment, whatever, that leaves visible, concrete asset on the ground, especially in the productive economic sector, rather than in the human development sector. And I think Africans have grown to accept the fact that their engagement with China is about productivity, economic growth and development, and their engagement with traditional donors is about the soft issues, human development, education, health, MDGs. In fact, that's what it is about. China does not worry too much about MDGs. China engages African countries and leave roads and factories. And I mean, you should visit Ethiopia. I've lived in Ethiopia for 7 years. Over the last 5 years alone, I think the Chinese have built within the capital city of Addis Ababa more than 600 kilometers of roads in Addis Ababa. When I moved to Addis, it took me 2 hours to get from home to my office. It takes me less than 20 minutes today because of Chinese roads. I mean, that is tangible, concrete, productive, I mean, in economic terms. So I think this is where the perception is coming from. Whether it's real, it's another question. But I think the perception is that Chinese engagement is more concrete, it's visible, it leaves something more productive. And I think Africans have resigned themselves to the fact that we engage China for one thing, we engage the West for another kind of, the normative things, the discussions, all the things we've talked about today should be left to the West. But when we want something concrete, we go to China. And that's the reality of today's world. And I think we need to live with that. Now, to go straight directly to the earlier issue raised by Dr. Kabonde about trilateral, can Africans, or can the West talk to Africa through China or the other way around? I mean, in other words, China must join the community of donors in order to deal with Africa. And China said, well, actually Africans have said, why must we go through the OECD DAC to engage China? And China's attitude is, we did not contribute to this OECD architecture, norms and values. All these things are Western assumptions or Western values. Why must China subscribe to values they did not contribute in creating in the first place. I mean, you look at Paris and all these things, these are all part and parcel of the 50 years or more of aid industry and its continual renewal and refinement and so on and so on. So China does not see itself, for them it's perhaps a waste of time to be subscribing to the dark OECD normative principles in order to engage Africa at a more practical level. That is not to say that China's engagement in Africa does not perhaps indirectly undermine democracy and governance. I think there's a real concern that the regimes that do not care about human rights and governance will use the China engagement as an excuse to bypass global norms also, which not just for the West, but I think the United Nations is also trying to promote. So those are real concerns. But I was just relaying the perception in Africa that if you want concrete things, you go to China. If you want to engage in endless discussions and discourse, you go to the normal traditional donors. And it's fine, you subscribe to, you discuss those things, but perhaps nothing comes out. So I think the challenge really is on the West to prove that partnership can really yield some concrete outcomes and results.
So DAC standards also reflects the need for developed countries, for democratic Western countries, to ensure legitimacy of their aid to their own citizens, so, which China doesn't need. So it means that we need to have some global frame ensuring good standards, because our citizens want to have this for being prepared to give nearly 1% of their income or 0.7% of their income to third countries. And this is the real point. Although we have a market economy with this more greater separation between public and private, we have also financial constraints and so on, which make that indeed, from legitimacy point of view and from point of view of the economic system, China obviously in higher, greater margin of maneuvers. And no, we have to have this also in mind. So we cannot replicate indeed what China does, but we need to understand how we can make our aid better, having a greater impact on growth indeed. No, but on sustainable growth. And that's the issue, because I'm not so sure this is not only a question of democratic governance, it's also of the sustainability of growth, it's also of the social standards which are being applied, where indeed we try at least to improve social standards in Africa. I'm not sure it is the case for China. So there is a lot of questions which need to be raised in this context, but indeed we are under competition.